Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. I'm Chris Muntz. Welcome to episode 3, What's in a Gesture? Today I will be sharing some thoughts about what truly makes a great conductor. Is it more about the gesture, or are there other attributes that make us either good at our job or maybe less than effective? I'll be joined later on the show with Bradley Ellingboe. I'm a big fan of Bradley's music, his compositions and arrangements, and he's also an accomplished conductor and taught at the college level for over 30 years, and we're going to be chatting about his thoughts on the topic as well. This episode is brought to you in part by SightReadingFactory.com, one of my saving graces as a teacher. You can go to Sight Reading Factory and basically reinvent yourself as a teacher if you're not using it right now. And by the way, it doesn't matter what level of singers you have. I even use Sight Reading Factory to audition professional singers. I can make those exercises tricky enough to give them fits, all the way down to my first year, never sung before by themselves, 14-year-olds. Everything that you need is there. So head over to sightreadingfactory.com and be sure to use code Choralosophy at checkout. You'll get a 10% discount. And I think you will really enjoy the process of using that in your classroom every day. So I'm going to start out this episode in earnest with a trip down memory lane for myself to undergraduate conducting class. I would venture to guess that all of us who have degrees in music education or some other type of conducting took this very first step, this conducting 101, whatever your school might have called it. And I bet you we all did a very similar project, which would be some type of major work, choral, orchestral, maybe. I think mine was Haydn creation. I don't remember. I've blocked it out. But I think that's what I did. And the assignment essentially was to have the score, get all the markings put in, and conduct along with a recording in front of the class with all of your appropriate markings in the music and make all the cues, right? You're conducting in front of a pretend ensemble for that very first time. That's what we did. I don't know that that's what you did, but I've talked to lots of people and they all seem to say that at some point in their young conducting training, they did this, right? And looking back on it now, I wonder what the heck that ever even taught me to do. Because the first thing that it makes me think is that it is a 100% gesture related assignment. And I think maybe shouldn't have been the first thing that we learned to do. And now this is just not a complaint of my teachers or anything like that, but I'm just being, I guess you could say, critical of how I was taught, and maybe so that I could think about whether or not there's another way. I've had a chance to work with lots of student teachers over the years, interns, young conductors that I've mentored, and I feel like I noticed the same things in almost every single one of them when they're first in front of a choir. And that is, they are thinking 100% about the gesture, not hearing anything, and not responding to anything at first. And let me first be the first one to say that was absolutely me when I was an undergraduate student, and probably for the first 2 or 3 years of teaching and conducting, that I was taught, and most of my focus early on was whether or not my gesture looked pretty, whether or not I was cueing the right group at the right time, and whether or not the angle of my arm and my wrist and all of the other things that I was doing was correct, to the point where looking back, I don't think I was hearing what the choir was doing. So what I've done for this episode, and this will be a game I ask Brad Ellingboe to play later also, is I've basically built a list of conductor attributes. And on Choralosophers, which is our Facebook page, where the conversation can always continue. If you're not on there, go on Facebook and search Choralosophers, and you'll have to ask to be a member, and approve you as soon as I can. That probably means you're listening to the show. But I'm going to list out some attributes that I think conductors should train, and that are all important things. And I first of all, I'm starting off the show being critical of my young first experience with conducting. I don't want to give the impression that I don't think gesture is important. I'm just going to maybe try to make the case that it's not the most important thing, and it maybe shouldn't even be the first thing that young conductors are taught. So here's my list, and on Choralosophers, if you want to make a post, be brave and start the trend to create your own rank of these items. Now, of course, I might influence you on what your rank is, and I might sway you, but I might not, but I would love to know what you think about this list. So 5 important things, and these are not necessarily the most important things to me, but I just listed 5 things that I think every really good conductor has, and if you hope to be a good conductor, you're going to have to get these things. And these are in no particular order yet. Number 1, ear for pitch and rhythm. I'll explain each of these in detail. Conducting gesture, that's obvious. Musical imagination, motivational skills, and verbal fluency. So I'm going to try to reason through all of those and put them in some kind of an order in which, if you had to choose one thing, ranking your priorities. If you think back to my episode 1 where I talked about ranking the priorities in your life to keep you happy, making sure that you're never sacrificing things at the top of your list for things on the bottom, I kind of view this in the same way. Meaning that if you, in a rehearsal, had to rely on one of your skills for some reason, what would be the number 1? So I'm going to define them clearly first, and then I'll attempt to make my case. So ear for pitch and rhythm, to me, doesn't mean per se that you can tell if notes and rhythms are correct, although that is an extension of it, and that would be an end result of it. But for me, that means audiation, the ability to hear the notes and rhythms playing correctly in your head. To me, is a very different skill than, for example, the way I used to teach when I first started, which was to have all of the singers singing along with the piano as we learned the notes, at which point I wasn't really using my ear for pitch and rhythm to determine if the kids, at that point, all of my conducting was teenage kids, if it was correct. I wasn't using my ear. All I was really doing, looking back, was listening for discrepancies between the piano and the singers, which is not the same thing as I hear the music playing accurately in my head. I'm the gatekeeper of the notes and rhythms in my own head, and if variances happen, they're happening from that CD track playing in my head. Okay, so when I say ear for pitch and rhythm, that's what I mean. Conducting gesture is, of course, the physical act of conveying what the CD that plays in your head should sound like. Considering that you can't sing all the parts for them as they go, you can't sing along with them. Well, I mean, you could, you probably shouldn't, but there is probably the one clearest way to show the CD playing in your head by using your hands and your body, of course, your facial expression, all the things that go into a good conducting gesture. Musical imagination, to me, is the idea of looking at the page of music. This ties into the ear for pitch and rhythm for me a little bit, but being able to look at the page of music and hear it playing in your head, and then imagine what it could be. So not just what it is, not just what the score markings say that it is to the letter, but having a vision immediately for what it could be when it, let's say you're rehearsing from the beginning, and when it stops sucking. And that's hard, especially in the age of YouTube. Often, how many times do we go online to find a recording of a piece to decide if we like it? Young teachers don't do that unless you have an excellent ear for pitch and rhythm in your own head. and then this musical imagination thing. So frequently I hear like I find a piece that I'm interested in doing, and the only recording I can find is pretty low quality. Don't let that scare you away. Imagine what it could be. I think that's an important skill. Motivational skills, file that under the category of getting people to do what you want them to do, convincing them that what you're trying to accomplish in your choir is worthwhile. It means something to them, even if they don't know it. I think our job as conductors is to make the case for what we're doing. And then verbal fluency is, of course, the ability to do that without having to do too much stopping and thinking about what it is that you're going to talk about. So that's one thing that verbal fluency for the conductor means to me. It's like, are you able to coherently explain what the choir needs to do, what they should do, what they should do next? It also, to me, refers to the speed with which you reply to their action. So in my opinion, a good starting place, again, for the young conductor, looking back on my own ineptitude when I was 23, would be that as I'm rehearsing the choir, I know that my ears and my musical imagination are not yet what a 40-year-old conductor probably has. Of course, I didn't know that back then. I thought I was better than all of them. Looking back now, I have no idea what I was doing. But let's assume that that's true. Let's assume that you're 23 and you don't quite have the ear for pitch and rhythm that maybe a more experienced conductor has. So I would strongly encourage the verbal fluency to be developed first. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say you're conducting through a bit of a rehearsal. You've given them the assignment of, we're going to sing from measure 22 to measure 63. And you know that you're going to need to free up a bunch of your mental energy for that rehearsal so that you can truly hear what they're doing. And meaning you can't be thinking about every possible outcome. And so here's a suggestion that I've used with student teachers and young teachers before is come up with 3 things. Here's what I'm going to say to the choir as soon as we stop if that attempt was total crap. It wasn't even close. I didn't need to listen for nuance because it was just really bad. Okay, so here's what am I going to say in that instance? A second response, which is, we almost got it. What am I going to say if they almost got it? It was a really good attempt, but there were some discrepancies, some disagreements of pitch and rhythm, maybe some nuance that we didn't quite get. What will be my response if that's the case? And then a third one, what if they blow your expectations out of the water? What are you going to say? And so my suggestion is to have those 3 always preloaded. If you're a person who doesn't feel super confident in your ability to listen, react, and come up with something genuine in the moment, and I would argue that for a lot of us, we start that way. We don't know what to say, and so we bumble and we stumble and we stop and pause. We listen for the choir to sing, and then we have to stop and think. And my argument to you on this verbal fluency part is that if you do that, you will lose them. And I don't care what level they are. It really does need to be cut off, instruction. Attempt again, cut off, instruction. And so for me, that's verbal fluency. So that last category or that last attribute I call verbal fluency is a very important one. So for me, here's my ranking. I think musical imagination is number 1. It is the separator between good teachers, conductors, and great ones is the ability to imagine what the music could be, not what it is, but what it could be or should be if you do your job. So that's number 1. But of course, tied directly into that, and which means has to go in at number 2, is the ear for the pitch and rhythm. Because if you can't hear the CD playing in your head, you're not going to be able to imagine what it possibly could be accurately. I think next for me are 2 more that are tied together in a lot of ways, and you might be able to guess. Motivational skills and verbal fluency are tied together. We motivate oftentimes through the way we explain things to people. We convince them that this is important. And if our verbal fluency skill is high, then we will be more able to do that effectively. And noticing that what that leaves us is in the fifth position, conducting gesture. So what I don't want to communicate is that I don't think conducting gesture is important. I just don't think it's the most important thing. And so taking that back to my original anecdote of the undergraduate conducting class, where oftentimes that is entire semesters or school years for the undergraduate, where that is all that's really being discussed, is the act of making physical gestures, marking things in your music that will be conveyed through that gesture, and then horror of horrors, conducting with a recording, which now looking back, I just don't understand. Because I think it gives us a false sense of accomplishment. I remember that sense of accomplishment very well when I was, 19, and I just conducted through Haydn's Creation or whatever it was, and I thought I had done something. I thought I'd accomplished something. And of course, I know now, and we all know, that recording would have sounded good no matter what I did. So whether I missed a cue, whether my gesture was tense, whether my wrist was floppy, all of the other things that young conductors do wrong, including the one time when I accidentally threw a baton at a soprano right in the front row of the choir. No matter what I do to bumble through it, the recording will still sound good, and I might very well get to the end thinking that I have accomplished something. And so my suggestion to us, and for most of you listening to this podcast, hopefully some of you out there are still students, but I would imagine most of you are already working professionals and have already gone through this, and it's too late in a sense to go back to undergraduate. And I think that this is a process that for all of us can start as soon as we recognize that there is development to be done for us in the way we hear music and the way we explain it to people. I think those are the critical attributes that I listed before. And so for the topic of this episode to be the conducting gesture, I think really what I'm conveying or what I'm trying to get across is that we might put too much emphasis, even in our identity for our careers, on conducting. And I recognize that it could be, and I'm not an expert, but it could be different in the instrumental world, although I don't think so. I don't have very much direct experience in the instrumental world, but I feel like I'm even uncomfortable when people ask me what I do for a living using the word conductor. I don't think of myself, or to use modern parlance, I don't identify as a conductor. When people ask me what I do, I say I'm a choral musician. Sometimes I say I'm a teacher if I feel like the explanation needs to be very drab. But I think of myself first as a choral musician, a conductor way down the list, meaning I will conduct if I have to. And that even goes with my high school kids. That is true in Contorai. We try to do things unconducted in that ensemble, relying on my ability to hear the pitch and rhythm, to imagine the music, to explain the process well enough, and then to trust the singers to do what they need to do. Very frequently with my high school kids, I don't conduct them at all. I'll give them a tempo and let them work it out. And I think in the long run, what that means is that I'm giving up some of my power, maybe some of the ego that goes along with guiding everything. But I would encourage you, if you've never taken that step, to just step away from the choir and just listen. Even if that seems scary, or taking a little bit of a concrete section of the music and warning them. My kids don't get a warning anymore. Sometimes I'll just walk away and they just know to keep singing unless I've cut them off. But if you've never done this before, warn them that you're just going to step off and you're going to sit down and they're going to start at whatever the challenging place is in the music. And I think you'll be surprised once they get over the initial shock of that oftentimes we as the conductor, with our gesture that doesn't always necessarily match how the music should feel, we just get in the way. And I discover this all the time, especially with highly rhythmic pieces. Uh, you know, the rhythms oftentimes, let's say a Sidney Guillaume piece. A lot of you guys know Sidney's music. I don't conduct those. I get in the way. When I try to conduct those, the tempo is frequently not as steady. The rhythms aren't as clear because kids are trying to match me and react at a tempo, at a speed that isn't natural. And so there's a certain amount of herky jerkiness that will happen at a certain tempo, and it's okay to just step away. So the suggestion for you in this episode is really to maybe take some pressure off yourself as a conductor. Think of yourself more as a listener and communicator. Ultimately, I think that's what makes us really good at what we do when we get to the point where we feel like we've really accomplished something as choir directors. I think for those of you who really do feel like you've had that a moment or a mountaintop moment as a conductor or as a teacher that you can look back and be truly proud of, I bet you very few of you look back with your fondest memory on a really cool cue you gave. You probably didn't. Your memories, just like your singer's memories, are from that one climactic chord, or maybe that one very emphatically and emotionally sung line of text in a performance. Or if you're like me, most of my best memories are in rehearsal, not in the performance at all. That's where I'm freest to be myself and to be in touch with my emotions about the music. So if we take the pressure off ourselves as conductors, it might free our ears up to become more responsive and allow the conducting gesture that we do end up showing, because again, it is important. It has to be done at some point throughout the rehearsal, but it might free up our gesture to look more like the music. And I think that's the ultimate lesson, is that the gesture has to look like the music. And it can't look like the music if you're not hearing it play in your own soul, in your own head, as you show the choir what to do. So, of course, we can all think back again to our undergraduate experiences, and we probably remember how rigid we were, how focused on down, across, out, up, down, across, out, out, up. And while that loud track was playing in our heads, guess what wasn't? The music. The music wasn't playing in our heads. So in the next little part of this episode, the second half of this episode, essentially, I'm going to be talking to Brad Ellingboe, who's a good friend and composer, and I'm really supportive of his new book that he's got coming out, especially for those of you who are in that younger demographic listening to the show that might be interested in a textbook that is a conducting textbook that goes so far beyond the gesture. It has no pattern diagrams in it. He'll explain that to us a little bit later. And I thought that was really interesting. It's about the whole self. And I will ask him to rank the 5 attributes as well. And I hope you'll enjoy that conversation. Main event, you might say, for this episode is my conversation already recorded with Bradley Ellingboe. Apologies in advance if there are any audio discrepancies. I was recording the conversation on a Skype call and had a few spotty internet spots, but I really think that you will enjoy this conversation and get some perspective that maybe you don't currently have. All right, I'm here with Bradley Ellingboe. Many of you know Bradley's music if you've performed it. He's a composer. He's also a conductor and now an author with a book about choral conducting coming out soon. And I'm excited to talk to him about his ideas of conducting and a variety of other topics related to that. So let's just dive right in. Bradley, thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks so much for asking me to be on your program.
Well, I'm excited. I've been a fan of your music for a long time, and one of the things that I think is funny, just a personal story about Brad's music. I have the fortunate circumstance of being able to conduct a college honor group in the summer, and about 5 years ago, we did his B Music Night And the students from that ensemble still refer to that year, even though we sang 30 minutes worth of music. They say, "Was that the B Music Night year?" Yeah, I remember. I remember that. That was their favorite piece on the program, and it's a beautiful,
Great.
beautiful one. So I'm excited to have Bradley here. We're going to start out with a little game. I've asked Bradley to think about 5 attributes a conductor has, and I want to hear what he thinks about the ranking of them. So here's what I gave him. I said an ear for pitch and rhythm, conducting gesture, musical imagination, motivational skills, and verbal fluency. Brad, talk to me about that list and how do you see the job of the conductor related to those attributes?
That is a really provocative sort of list. Well, not provocative, I guess, but here's how I would answer it. I saw your list a day or so ago, and I thought, okay, clearly it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now I've been thinking about it, and it keeps changing, at least in my mind, because of the importance of all 5 things that you've listed. However, I still come back even this morning to musical imagination as being the first thing. I think really, Alice Parker once came to the University of New Mexico and worked with our students, and she said at that time, just kind of an offhand comment, that she thought that the printed page could represent about 5% of what the composer meant. And I thought, well, she's kind of exaggerating to make a teaching point. But that's been some years I've been thinking about it in the meantime. And I think she may be right. Therefore, the imagination of the conductor to try and interpret, intuit, if you will, what the composer meant from those dots and squiggles and so forth, I think is central, because without that, nothing else follows. Then the other 4 attributes you asked me to rank are all in service of trying to make the page come to life.
Mm-hmm.
So then I had motivation as second, at least this morning, because one of my quips is, I'm just a guy waving my arms. My arms don't make any sound. So we have to motivate the people that are in front of us singing to really wish to do this. And through the years, I have known people that probably knew more about choral music than I did, but were not really very successful at getting people to come on the journey with them.
Mm-hmm.
There's a different way to do it. Different people do it. Some people are cheerleaders, some people are scholars, some people are philosophers. And I think we're probably all a combination of those things. But there's got to be some reason that you will show up on Wednesday nights, or so. I guess if you take it for a class, but let's put that to the side. We have to presume that somebody wants to be there, and that the person standing in front of the group is kind of central to that reason. As much as they may love singing, they want to sing in a group because of the person in front.
Yeah, they could be there in mind or in spirit. They could be there in body, but not in mind or spirit. Yeah, that's
Right.
absolutely right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so. And then, of course, the synergy that you're looking for, where 2 + 2 = 5. I think, lots of that comes from, if you pick the right people and so forth. The group can create it themselves, but I still, kind of subscribe to the idea that the person in front has got to provide that and be, I don't know, maybe this is old fashioned, but sort of the person that plays the organ. The person standing in the front is sort of in charge of the keyboard,
Mm-hmm.
if you will. Then the last 3 attributes, I couldn't. These are the ones that have really shifted around a lot for me. I think that gesture and verbal fluency are kind of tied in a way, because some people, I think, explain it really well and don't conduct as prettily as we could hope, and some people conduct really in a gorgeous way and want their arms to tell the story. I mean, if you can have both, it's great. I think conducting may be a little bit more, no, I shouldn't say important, but more efficient. If you can just show it, then it's probably faster than explaining it. And
Yeah.
then the ear, well, then all of a sudden I have, ear in number 5, and I really think it's it's sort of number 1, and I have to restart the list.
I intentionally made it a tricky list.
Right, you didn't have any obvious dogs in that race.
Yeah, one of the, you tied conducting and verbal fluency together in a lot of ways. For me, when I think about ranking those, I tie the ear to the imagination one, because if you can't hear pitches and rhythms in your head, it's very difficult for you to imagine how the music should sound before you show it to the choir, before you explain it.
Oh, right.
And I think it's
Oh, you're exactly right.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say I think it's a surprising thing. Uh, and I know we'll get to this in a second. I'd like to hear some of your stories of how you feel like you've grown in these areas. But for me, that is something that I can do now at approaching age 40 that I could not do at age 23. Just my ability to take a look at a score and hear it happening in my head.
Well, actually, I've often said that that sort of mental tape that you're playing. Well, I guess I date myself. That mental MP4 that you're playing is what guides your arms. And as a composer, just a little anecdote. One of the things that I've had to get better at as the years have gone by is that if I wrote the piece myself, the mental image of it is playing so strongly in my own head that I'm not always listening to whether or not it's really happening in real time with real people.
Uh-huh.
You see what I mean?
Uh-huh.
And I think we all, as conductors, have that imagination that you're trying to convey to your group through your facial affect and your gestures and so forth. But when it's your very own piece, sometimes that tape is playing pretty loudly.
I imagine.
If you see what I mean.
Yeah, I think
you're not actually listening to if it's happening or not.
Right. Yeah, and I think that does happen even with conductors, even if they didn't write the piece. Is there's a certain amount of overlap of two tracks. You might think you've got like a track playing of what you expect to hear, and then there's what the choir is actually doing. And I agree that's a really good way of putting it, is that sometimes the track in your imagination is too loud to hear what the choir is actually doing. And that's something that we just have to fight against all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit about, we just like to kind of hear some stories from you about your conducting journey, specifically as the kind of official topic of this episode on our show is we're talking about the conductor. So I'd be curious because I have my own experiences and I always like to know how other conductors see their journey from young conductor to more experienced conductor. About even you can even use the things on my list as a reference of things that you feel like or stories that you have of how you were able to grow in one of those areas, or any intentional steps you took along your way to build your skills.
Well, that's an interesting, and thanks for saying from a young conductor to a more experienced one as opposed to an old conductor. I had a really good education. I went to St. Olaf College in Eastman and had a lot of well-known teachers. And as a young conductor, especially, and even to this day, I used to think of it, I have this phrase where I talk about choral lore, Lore, things that are just sort of passed down that aren't in books. You watch people you admire and observe how they do things. And I think as a young person, you're bag of tricks is particularly based on imitating somebody that, or trying to channel somebody that you admired, maybe your college director or, somebody of that ilk. And I never thought that was terribly successful. I mean, even as a young person, I think I knew that everybody has to be their own individual in front of their group. But, you know, as you get older, you get sort of a more experienced bag of tricks. Oh, this doesn't work, I'll try that. That doesn't work, I'll try the other. And when you're 23, you've got, four things in your bag of tricks. And when you're 60, you've got exponentially more. So as I was growing as a young conductor, what occurs to me to tell you about is I got my job at the University of New Mexico when I was 27. And, I had been spun out of some pretty exalted programs. And then I had the one choir I had at first, because I came on as a combination voice teacher, choir director, was a non-auditioned oratorio society of about 140 people. And so it was, non-auditioned. It was massive, and I was used to these elite auditioned groups. And so at first, I guess, to be honest, I felt like, well, gosh, how come I fell off the turnip truck and, got this bunch of people that don't know nothing about nothing. And, but then what I realized is it was this combination of students, faculty, townspeople, staff people at the university, and lots of them knew a lot about things I didn't know anything about. I mean, there was the head of the medical school sitting next to a prominent local attorney, sitting next to somebody who was a certified public accountant, and what I had to realize was these people were very intelligent. I just couldn't use jargon. I couldn't use shorthand. If I said this needs to be more marcato, I might have to explain what marcato was. But that, I think, was one of the most important things on my journey. I never was a high school teacher, and in some ways I find that to be a real gap in my set of experiences. But in a way, I thought, well, even if this person is 60 years old and went to Harvard, they may need to know the same things that a high school student would be taught when they were in choir in 11th grade. The word marcato means such and such. The word legato means such and such. And I did that for 30 years, and that made me a really good teacher, I think. Well, if I say so myself. But that was where I learned the most about teaching, because I had to always presume, ground zero. And then, but then we were trying to do things along with the university orchestra and auditioned ensembles that eventually I became director of choral activities. And so I was in charge of the whole program, and we were doing Verdi's Requiem or, Beethoven's Mass in C or something like that, in which case I had to get them up to speed. And then that brings up your other point. Then the more I could get them to look at me, then the more fluency I had in gesture, the quicker the process went. And eventually, I was the guy who was there for 30 years, so everybody knew what they were getting into when they walked in, but and now this is 35 years ago, not 35 years ago.
Okay, so here's another, just an angle I'd like you to try to address for those, we'll call them young conductors who are just starting out in their career. And, so let's say you're 25 and still at this point in your life, most of your experience as a conductor has been in an academic setting. It's been in a classroom. It's been reading out of a book, very little in front of an actual choir. And it might be hard for you to visualize, if you're that age, a career like yours where you've been doing it for so long with all these bag of tricks. Looking back on those 35 years, what percentage of your bag of tricks would you say has just been developed over time through trial and error versus learned from those awesome educators you were taught by when you were younger?
Oh, that is an excellent question.
I do my best.
well, well, I'll give you an A plus. Uh, I I would say at this juncture, I my the things I figured out on my own would be, gosh, it's kind of hard to separate. It's sort of body, mind, spirit. Kind of the whole person is a combination of things. Um, Backing up a step, and something I meant to say a minute ago about choral lore. I used to think of it, that game we used to play as kids called telephone, where you whisper in the ear of your neighbor who whispers in the ear of his neighbor and her neighbor, and then you see how garbled the message got by the
Right.
time 10 people whisper it to each other. I didn't want to garble the message that I had gotten from these really fine educators. So I was always as careful as I could be about that. But two things changed. One was just time passes, um, and students are always the same and always a little different. So Kenneth Jennings, who was my mentor at St. Olaf, retired when he was 65. He came from a very long-lived family, and I said, Dr. Jennings, you could, I'm sure, teach until you didn't want to teach anymore. Why are you quitting now? And he said, well, because the way I teach is now different than the way they learn.
Ah,
He had taught there for 38 years, and he'd done a great job. And he just said, I'm just gonna stop now while I'm
mm-hmm,
ahead.
mm-hmm.
And so time passes, and students, you know, you need different analogies. If you're going to relate to something current, you can't talk about Seinfeld and Friends anymore. You have to, you'd have to know the new show. But so getting back to your original question, I would say that I had this wonderful basis, and then I was translating for students at a large public university in the Southwest as opposed to private institutions in the Midwest and the Northeast. And I was taught by people who were very formal. And I grew up, um, if my dad was still alive, he'd be 101. My parents were from a different era, and I was brought up um, in that fashion. And then I found that that formality doesn't work in the Southwest, and
Uh-huh.
and so I was continually having to uh, reconfigure. The paradigm kept changing,
Yeah.
and so ultimately, to answer your question, I'd say that was probably 30% of what I had learned from my mentors, and 70% of what I had learned on the job. But that the percentage of my own bag of tricks got bigger as I um, evolved into the position, in the place, in the time that I was teaching.
Right. Yeah. That's something that I come across working with high school students, especially if they get to their senior year of high school and they're thinking about music education. And it's actually as a career, and it's a pretty common conversation where they will say something to me like, I'd like to teach music, but I just don't see any way that I could do it like you, Mr. Muntz. And I like, well, first of all, you don't need to do it like me. You need to figure out how to become you and do it like you. When I was your age, I couldn't do anything that I'm doing now. And so I always think that that's a helpful perspective for younger folks to see that we are not who we are going to become. And that's hard to see when you when you're younger. So tell me a little bit about your book. I'd like to hear more about that. I saw on Facebook an announcement that you were coming out with a conducting book very soon. And so my assumption before having seen it, I've now seen an advanced copy and skimmed all the way through it and read some chapters, and was that it was a book mostly on the gesture, but it turns out that's not true. You've really written an all-encompassing guide for what I think would be a really good choice for a young conductor to take a look at and to see all types of things that goes into being a conductor, all the way from lit selection to gesture to exercises to use with your choir. It's really a thorough textbook. Tell us more about that.
Well, thank you. My quip is it's everything I know about conducting, and it's 7 pages long. But no, it's I just kind of started writing and stopped when I sort of got to the end, I guess. I had taught conducting for 30 years or more, I guess, and got, in the summers and so forth, given lots of workshops. And so I had all of these various topics that I had dealt with. And the process in the last year or so has been to take all of these talks and lectures and go back over them and give them the same sort of tone, because some I had written in 2000 and some I had written last year. So the idea is, I hope, how to be a sort of as complete a conductor as you know how, so that you're dealing with all kinds of things like what happens the first time you're in front of an orchestra, or how do you make sure when you choose repertoire that you're giving your choir what I call a balanced diet, because we all like, if you like slow and pretty stuff, are you picking only slow and pretty things? If you like rhythmic up-tempo deals, are you picking that mostly? And, so here, write it all down, choose some easy, some moderately difficult, some difficult things, and then tailor your warm-up exercises to filter right into the first thing you're going to practice. Plan your rehearsal out so it's got a beginning, middle, and end. Just all kinds of things. There are 10 chapters ultimately, and actually one of the chapters would even go back a little bit to what we had been talking about 5 minutes ago, which is how to create your conducting persona. And which sounds sort of false, but I think you just want to be deliberate in your choices. So for instance, like any of us, I'm different with my wife than I am with my children. I'm different with my boss than I am with my college roommate. And they're all legitimate versions of me. But when I go in front of a group, I sort of plan which jacket I'm going to put on, if you will. And when you were talking about your student saying, well, I don't know how I could do it like you, Mr. Muntz. At first, when you're a young person, I'm trying to decide, am I going to act like Ken Jennings now, or am I going to act like Don Newen now, or am I going to act like, But eventually you go, no, this is my auditioned top choir, and I'm going to be this kind of Brad in front of them. And this is my church choir of lovely, non-auditioned, middle-aged people that show up on a volunteer basis, and I'm going to be a different version of that.
Yeah,
so
that's a really good point.
Address all of the different aspects that a conductor and just, I would say in a nutshell, if you think about it, probably most of this seems self-evident, but it took me about 40 years to think about it and declare self-evident.
Yeah, there was a formative experience I had that your statement reminded me about, that when you're young and trying to, figure out your persona. When I was in my senior year of my undergraduate, and we had an assignment, a lot of us had these types of assignments in undergrad, where we had to go out and teach a sample lesson to a class of kids somewhere, maybe in your practicum or student teaching or something like that. And uh, one of the assignments was that I was supposed to videotape that lesson and then take it to a mentor or someone we looked up to and have them kind of evaluate that. And my high school choir teacher was Steve Perry from Lee Summit, and I chose to bring the video to him. And of course, I'm 22 years old, and he was my hero in high school. And of course, the
Hmm.
way I had visioned it in my head was that I was going to teach this lesson. I was going to show Steve the video, and his eyes were going to well up with tears from pride of how wonderful I had grown as a young person, and was how good of a teacher I was going to become. And I showed him the video, and the first thing he said was, "Chris, I'm so bored. I want to tear out my eyebrows." And of course,
Oh,
I
you
of course I'm
cried.
crushed. Yes, I'm crushed. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And in my head, I had thought I used a bunch of really big words. I told a bunch of really interesting stories and had, facts lined up and all kinds of things. And he said, "But that wasn't you. That you're funny, you're goofy, you're engaging. I didn't see any of those personality traits when I watched you teach that lesson. I saw you memorizing a routine."
Uh,
And it was formative for me. Of course, I didn't like it in the moment. Uh, I was very crushed in the moment, but
Still remember it.
yeah, oh, I still remember it, and I remember learning the value of trying to be myself in front of. But like you said, it is a very different self than you are have in other situations. But that's a really good point, and I think for young conductors, important. On your book, how would you describe who your ideal audience is? Is it designed to be a textbook for a conducting class, or is it something that you envision someone using as supplemental material?
Well, that's a good point. I've tried to serve multiple masters, and I think the actual published book will come out tomorrow, and so I'm probably too close to it right now to answer the question, but I'll try. Which is uh, the two sort of groups I had in mind. One was that a church choir director who came to the job in a fashion that I call sideways. I mean, there are certain, churches that have 75 in their adult choir, and the person who leads them is full time and has their doctorate in church music or choral conducting or something. But really, the reality is that a lot of people come to this. They go to a church that has 250 members and they have 12 people in the choir and not much budget, and they say, "Well, look, you played oboe in the college orchestra. You know more about choir music than any of the rest of us. Will you lead the choir?" And the person goes, "Well, I guess. I didn't take conducting. I never had voice lessons." So the book is a little bit meant for that. And then, by the same token, though, there are a variety of examples and worksheets in the back, and you can do it yourself. There's not a right and wrong. It's sort of, how to pick repertoire, and here's a template that's going to help you. There's no right or wrong per se, so there's no grade at the end. But the thought being that it could also be of use for undergraduate or even graduate conducting classes at the college level, university level. Um, but it doesn't say, here's how you conduct forward, down, in, out, up. There's the presumption that people already have basic gestural ability, and now let's take it the next step.
I see.
But it's not going to be, what should we say, analysis of Stravinsky's Symphony of Psalms either. It's sort of a middle ground.
I see. Okay, that's great. And so I will tell the listeners out there that we are having this conversation via Skype on February 7th. So when Brad says that it will come out tomorrow, you will hear this episode and the book will already be out. So what I think I'll do is once we are offline, I'll have Brad send me a link to the best place to get the book, and I will put it on the website with the the launch of the podcast so that you can simply click and check that out. And what it's published by who, Brad?
Chose Music, KJOS, Neil A. Chose Music, been my longtime publisher there in San Diego. And so it's kjos.com, but we'll send you a direct link to the product itself.
Yeah, that sounds good. And will people at the ACDA convention be able to find copies?
Absolutely. We'll have a booth there. And, I mean, knock on wood, I suppose something could go wrong. But presuming it comes out tomorrow, we will be making a big push at the end of this month at the convention in Kansas City.
Awesome.
Your town.
Yes, I'm excited for everybody to come and hang out and nerd on choir for a while. It's going to be a lot of fun. Well, thank you, Brad, for coming on and sharing your stories and your expertise with us. And I'm really excited for people to see your book, and also for those of you out there who have not had the privilege of having your choirs do Brad's music. Definitely go check it out. There's some beautiful stuff, both original compositions and arrangements that you just got to try. So definitely get out there and do that. Thanks, Brad, for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much, and best of luck to you on this new venture.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you made it this far in the episode, all the way to the end, that must mean that you found something interesting enough to stick around. So I hope you'll come back for future episodes. You should be able to find 4 episodes on the channel right now. If you're listening as this comes out in end of February, more episodes will be coming out, a couple each month. There are things that you can do to stay involved in the conversation with the show that I encourage you to do. Several things that are very helpful to the show and to my ability to do this long term is, of course, go check out the sponsors that are putting themselves out there on the show. Go on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, find the show, Choralosophy. You can find it there and interact there, be part of the conversation. There is also a private Facebook group called Choralosophers that you can look up and ask to be a member of. And that is a site that I hope to use as a continuation of all of the episodes and the conversation that goes there. And then, of course, if you are really interested in the resources that you see this show possibly providing and that you like what you've heard so far, you can also support the show with a subscription of any size on the website choralosophy.com, as well as finding resources there, links to each of the episodes, as well as any articles or books discussed. So head over to choralosophy.com and be part of the conversation.